Hey, I need those.
Alright, I got these $10 shoes from Walmart just to do this. It's gonna be really hard. I'm gonna give it a shot, but oh my gosh, I've never done this before. How does this work? How do you do this?
Fail.
Oh my god. Jeez. Oh, that was so close. That was right there. I got. Oh. Oh my god. If you grew up in the late 90s and early 2000s, you probably remember watching a movie called Big Fish, made by Tim Burton, one of the most unique film directors of all time, and one of my personal favorite directors ever. This guy was instrumental in making my childhood awesome and created some of the most memorable films I've ever watched as a child, from Beetlejuice to The Nightmare Before Christmas, or the original Batman movies or Edward Scissorhands, as well as some lesser-known films that have since been somewhat forgotten or regarded as too weird or random to be considered classics. And one of those somewhat lesser-known films was Big Fish. But if you're familiar with my channel in any capacity, you'll likely already know that I don't plan on just running through the plot of this wonderful film and giving my surface-level opinions. Instead, I'm going to investigate the deeper hidden meaning and purpose of this film, and see if I can draw any interesting comparisons or identify the primary inspirations for this film. Alright, it happens like this. Edward Bloom is telling his young son Will a tall tale about how he caught the biggest fish in Ashton, a town in Alabama where he grew up, using nothing other than his wedding ring. We then fast forward several decades to a now adult Will's wedding night. His father is once again telling the tall tale at Will's wedding reception, which greatly frustrates Will and leads to an argument between him and his father, where Will admits that he resents Edward for never being straightforward about his past, and that due to Edward relating his entire life to his son Will through fantastical fables and myths, Will feels like they're essentially strangers. After 3 years of no longer speaking to his father, Will receives a call that they're taking his father off chemotherapy, and that he likely has very little time left, leading to Will traveling from France back to America to see Edward off. The remainder of the film after this point is told via a series of flashbacks which mix elements of Edward's actual life with the fantastical fictional stories that he would tell his son Will as a child, which is an extremely interesting way of presenting the film. We briefly learn about Edward's childhood, or at least the version of his childhood that he most preferred, which begins with an obviously fictional account of the time he and a few childhood friends confronted an evil witch in a swamp who had a glass eye that would show you how you were going to die. Miley Cyrus is in this movie. Several of Edward's friends see their future deaths, which are shown to the audience. However, Edward's death is never shown, although he seems rather content with it and actually sort of happy. The film then cuts to current day, which will happen throughout the remainder of the film, and Will speaks to Edward for the first time in several years. It's during this conversation that we learn that Edward was absent for a large portion of Will's childhood, which comes up in discussion as Will's about to have his first child. It's obvious that Will's resentment for his father is deep-rooted and goes back to his childhood. That not only was Edward's life a mystery veiled behind obvious tall tales, which Will considered flat-out lies, but that his father was also absent for most of Will's formative years, and that even on his deathbed, his father refuses to be straight with Will, coming off as disrespectful and very cold. We're shown another flashback, and I think this is one of the most important moments we're shown in the film. A young Will is sick with chickenpox, and so his father Edward tells him another tall tale about how as a child he was sick and bedridden for 3 years, due to an abnormal growth spurt. I'll just point out that like many things in this movie, this idea was entirely the invention of Tim Burton and John August, and does not appear in the source material, the novel of the same name by Daniel Wallace. Young Edward, confined to his bed and experiencing some sort of gigantism, or as he calls it in the film,
Gigantificationism.
he comes across an article about how goldfish will grow to the size of their living space. I say this is likely the most important moment in the film because it's all an analogy for Edward and his quest. I'll come back to this later on. So the flashback skips to Edward a few years older, probably about 17, where he's now played by Ewan McGregor.
Hello there.
And again, keep in mind, this is all being told through the lens of Edward's tall tales he's telling his young son. So take it all with a grain of salt. But basically, Edward was an ultra giga chad alpha male who absolutely dominated life and was great at everything. Towards the beginning of the novel, it's said that men, women, and even animals loved Edward. In this flashback, we see him winning football games, basketball games, science fair competitions. He even starts a successful business and rescues animals from burning buildings, all before the age of 18. One day, a giant named Carl begins terrorizing the people of Ashton, eating all their livestock and crops in the dead of night. So of course Edward, equipped with the knowledge of his own death, fearlessly steps up to try to talk to the giant and convince him to leave Ashton. This is another very important moment in the film. Edward very cleverly explains to Carl that he'll let Carl eat him as a sacrifice. This was done to win Carl's trust, We learn that Carl is actually just a normal man with gigantism, and can't control his appetite. In this conversation, Carl calls Edward's bluff and realizes that Edward is just trying to get him to leave, to which Edward responds that this is the truth, but that he wants to leave with him. But a small town like Ashton just isn't big enough for a man of his ambition. As Edward and Carl are leaving Ashton, the witch tells Edward that the biggest fish in the river gets that way by never being caught. This reminded me of an old story, one of Aesop's fables. The story is told like this. A poor fisherman who lived on the fish he caught had bad luck one day and caught nothing but a very small fish. The fisherman was about to put it in his basket when the little fish said, "Please spare me, Mr. Fisherman. I'm so small, it's not worthwhile to carry me home. When I am bigger, I shall make you a much better meal." But the fisherman quickly put the fish into his basket. "How foolish I should be," he said, "to throw you back. However small you may be, you are better than nothing at all." The point of this fable is simple. You should always take advantage of the opportunities presented to you in life rather than waiting for perfect conditions. Don't ever wait for everything in life to be perfect before you act, or you'll never accomplish anything. This is a valuable lesson and speaks to the nature of Edward in the film. He never waits for his conditions in life to be perfect. He takes advantage of every opportunity, and as we'll see, he takes the witch's advice and makes sure never to be caught. Edward and Carl come upon a crossroads, and Edward explains that since he never plans on returning to Ashton, he might as well see where the alternate path leads. This is where the film and the novel diverge quite a lot. In the novel, Carl doesn't actually leave Ashton with Edward, but instead he becomes the biggest farmer in Ashton, so he can grow as much food as he wants. In the novel, there is no crossroads at all, but rather one single road out of Ashland. By the way, in the novel, the town that Edward comes from is called Ashland. Tim Burton and screenwriter John August changed it to Ashton. Don't know why. Anyway, there's only one path out of Ashland, and it leads through a town called The Place with No Name. Towards the end of the novel, Edward visits a town called Spectre. So Tim Burton and John August just combined Spectre and The Place with No Name as one town. A creative decision that ended up working really well. In the novel, The Place with No Name is known to all the townsfolk of Ashland, and it's said that those who are meant to move on pass through the town unharmed, but those who are meant to stay will be trapped in The Place with No Name forever. In the novel, The Place with No Name is a mirror image of Ashland, but foggy and dated. The stores contain items that predate Edward's birth. It's very obvious that this place is meant to be some sort of purgatory, and the gatekeeper of this town is a vicious dog who will bite off your fingers if you aren't destined to pass through. Edward sees many people in this town who he recognizes from his childhood, including the poet Norther Winslow, who's missing a few fingers. The dog ends up guiding Edward through the town as he was destined for greater things. In an interview for the novel, the author Daniel Wallace confirms that The Place with No Name is some sort of purgatory, and that the dog is based on Cerberus, the gatekeeper of Hades. He explains that this is an analogy for people who try to escape the small towns they grew up in, only to fail and watch their dreams die. Just as the rain and wetness of The Place with No Name in the novel is said to be the product of people's broken dreams, and that Edward, who is destined for greatness, would be able to escape this town of death and decay and move on to bigger and better things. And the more you read the novel, the more apparent it becomes that water is the primary symbol used throughout the story. In the film, the town of Spectre stands in for The Place with No Name. However, John August and Tim Burton clearly base several elements of Spectre on the town from the novel. The way that the townspeople of Spectre desperately try to keep Edward from leaving, even stealing his shoes and throwing them on a line. In the film, it's very obvious that Spectre is meant to be some sort of purgatory that keeps people from leaving the small town of Ashton to pursue their dreams. This is why when Norther Winslow reads his poetry to Edward, it's really bad, because he was a garbage poet and therefore wasn't able to fulfill his dreams of going to France to be a great poet.
Roses are red, violets are blue. I love Spectre.
I love how when Edward first arrives at Spectre, there's a guy playing the banjo tune from Deliverance. In the film, the people of Spectre keep telling him that he's early, reinforcing the idea that this is the place you go after death, or rather a place one goes to die. And the next scene is pure Tim Burton and very goofy and strange with the rocking chairs and everything. It's supposed to have a goofy, backwards, creepy, hillbilly vibe to it. And the whole barefoot thing is another invention of August and Burton, not from the novel at all. Spectre in the film has a much warmer feel to it than The Place with No Name in the novel. It's almost paradisical and heavenly, where the town in the book is closer to hell. And the scene when they're dancing always cracks me up. It's just such a goofy moment. And in the film, as Edward is escaping from Spectre, he remembers that this isn't how he dies, although in the novel, Edward wouldn't meet the witch until after this point. The order of events varies dramatically from the novel to the film. In the film, before Edward leaves Spectre, he meets a mermaid and then speaks with a little girl named Jenny, the same girl who stole his shoes. However, in the novel, Edward meets the mermaid at a different time in the story. In honor of this video, I actually visited the town of Spectre in the film, which is an actual existing location on Jackson Lake Island in Millbrook, Alabama, and I can confirm that this area is likely just as remote as depicted in the film. Unfortunately, a few years after filming wrapped for Big Fish, the entire commercial district of the town burned down, and after a decade, the set had become very dilapidated and worn down. However, it still has a lot of charm and was a very novel experience, getting to stand in the middle of the town that I had seen so many times in the film. Although much of the town is now missing, it was still a very surreal experience just being there, and the surrounding river and forest areas were incredibly beautiful, with hundreds of goats patrolling the grounds. I did try to look inside some of the buildings and houses, but they were completely empty and too destroyed for me to trust, with a lot of broken glass and unsafe-looking floorboards, and the church from the film being used as some sort of barn house for the goats to live in. But after exploring the town of Spectre, we made sure to spend a little time with the goats before taking off. So if you're ever driving through Alabama, consider checking this place out before it's gone. And it's a campground, so maybe do a little camping. We were cracking up a little bit when we tried to leave because a large goat actually sat directly in the middle of the road, making it impossible to leave. So just like Edward in the story, I had a bit of a hard time actually leaving Spectre. Edward escapes Spectre and reunites with Carl, and we cut back to the current day, where Edward continues telling tall tales to Will and his wife. And we get one of his many long-winded dad jokes.
This morning, the milkman dropped dead on the porch because, see, my mother was banging the milkman.
In this particular joke, the one about the milkman, is actually straight out of the book. Now, as far as dad jokes go, my father is the king, and I literally grew up hearing the worst and most long-winded dad jokes you could possibly imagine. So I find this aspect of Edward's character incredibly relatable. Edward then tells Will's wife, Josephine, another tall tale about how he met Will's mother, Sandra. And this sequence is almost entirely written by John August and has almost no basis in the novel whatsoever. Now, if you watched my Mirror Mask video, you already know that I love the circus, so this addition to the story was a welcome one for me, and I absolutely love this part of the film. This is part of the reason why I think the screenplay for Big Fish is an improvement on the source material. And I'll also note that this is the first of 2 films made by Tim Burton where Danny DeVito plays a circus owner. In fact, it's basically the same exact character as the circus owner in Dumbo from 2019. DeVito also plays the Penguin in Tim Burton's 1992 film Batman Returns. And it's always good to see another longtime Burton collaborator, Deep Roy, in one of Burton's films.
Augustus Gloop will not be harmed. Augustus Gloop will not be harmed.
So during the performance, the circus owner Amos Calloway presents a very unimpressive giant, which leads Edward to introducing Carl, an actual giant, to Amos. So Carl signs a contract with the circus. During the performance, Edward experiences a love-at-first-sight moment, and you might recognize this girl if you watched my video on the movie Drag Me to Hell. I really love this scene where time stops, and it's one of those core memories I have from seeing this film as a child. Amos promises Edward that he will give him one piece of information about her for every month that he works at the circus. I just wanted to point out that the joke from Amos about the elephant sitting on the farmer's wife is very clever given the context of the film. Being that this clearly fictional story is being told from old Edward's perspective, it's very fitting with the type of joke he would be expected to tell. So Edward begins working for Calloway, and every month he's given one little piece of info about this girl. Now, in the novel, water is used symbolically many times, and it's safe to say that Edward was thirsty. He literally works at the circus for 3 years, which is the same amount of time he spent in bed during his growth spurt. So finally, Edward gets fed up with waiting to be with the girl of his dreams, so he confronts Calloway. It turns out to be an animagus who turns into a vicious dog at every full moon. This was clearly a reference to Dog from the novel, the same dog who would bite off the fingers of anyone who tried to leave Ashland. And just like in the novel, this dog took kindly to Edward and allowed him to pass on to his next point in life.
Danny DeVito's ass.
Amos Calloway finally tells Edward that the girl's name is Sandra Templeton and that she goes to Auburn University. In the novel, Edward also goes to Auburn and simply meets Sandra there, so the film is a bit of a far cry. And in the novel, while attending Auburn University, Edward lives with the witch and confronts Don Price. So back to the film, Edward finds Sandra's sorority house and tells her flat out that he loves her even though they've never met. Not a very good strategy, honestly. Sandra tells Edward that she's already engaged to Don Price, that douche who Edward knew from Ashton. Why does this actor always play douchebags?
Right!
So after Don beats the crap out of Edward, Sandra gives him back his engagement ring. This guy has a lot of trouble getting married to women. So immediately after being engaged to Sandra, Edward gets drafted for 3 years? 3 years. that shows up 3 times in this movie. So he took the most risky assignment available to get his time in the army reduced as much as possible. He parachutes into a Korean army talent show and convinces 2 conjoined twin sisters to help him escape in exchange for making them into celebrities back in America. And after believing he had died, Sandra is reunited with Edward. Returning to modern day, Will has a conversation with his wife Josephine, where he admits his suspicions that his father may have had a second life, or that he hated his real life so much that he avoided his family, and that his father had never told him a true thing. Will gets into a somewhat heated conversation with Edward where he explains that his father is like an iceberg, that he can only see 20% of him, and that he has no idea who he is, that he's as real to Will as Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny, and that Will is about to have his own child, and he can't understand how his father could lie to him all this time, which leads to Edward lashing out at Will, telling him that it's his own failing, that he couldn't understand his life.
Just show me who you are for once.
I've been nothing but myself since the day I was born. And if you can't see that, it's your failing, not mine.
While digging through Edward's old tool shed, Will comes across some documents proving that his father had really gone missing during the war. And at this moment, Will realizes that there was more truth to his father's stories than he had realized. After returning home from the war, Edward becomes a salesman, something that actually holds some truth in Edward's actual life. While on the road in Texas, Edward comes across Norther Winslow from Spectre, something that never occurs in the novel, who tells him that Edward inspired him to pursue bigger things. Norther forces Edward to help him rob a bank. Edward tells Norther that the real money is in Wall Street, and after making $1 million on Wall Street, Norther sends Edward $10,000, which Edward uses to buy a house. I just want to say I always love the way Edward holds Sandra's chin. It's so sweet and adds a unique touch to the film. While Will is looking through his dad's keepsakes, he comes across a property deed purchased by his father with the name Jennifer Hill in Spectre, Alabama. Realizing even more that not all of his father's stories were fiction, Will travels to this address and meets Jenny. Will assumes that Jenny was a woman with whom his father had been having an affair. She explains that his father had visited Spectre twice in his life, once early and once late. The second time, he was caught in a flood. In the novel, a flood destroys a large portion of Ashland, and Edward is brought underwater by a great catfish, where he sees the townsfolk living their usual lives just underwater. This is the film paying tribute to that portion of the book. And interestingly, the set piece used for Jenny's house in Millbrook, Alabama was actually destroyed by a flood. Edward comes back to the town of Spectre, but now it's much more similar to the place with no name from the novel. It's a ghost town. Jenny explains to Will that Edward had bought the town of Spectre via investments from people he had made rich, Norther Winslow, Amos Calloway, and the Siamese twins, who he had made famous. And just like in the novel, Edward purchases every parcel of land without asking anything from the people of Spectre. When Edward goes to purchase Jenny's property, this is one of the few moments that is transcribed almost word for word from the book, when Jenny refuses to sell her property to Edward. However, this scene takes a dramatic turn from the novel, and in the film, after Jenny agrees to sell her property to Edward, she claims that she was the witch from the beginning of Edward's story, which obviously makes no sense. Jenny explains to Will that she wanted to be important to his father, and I take that to mean that she wanted to be a part of his history, hence making herself the witch in his story. After returning home, Will learns that his father had a stroke and is now in the hospital. After Will and his family arrive at the hospital and speak to Dr. Bennett, Sandra says her goodbyes to Edward and does that cute chin thing. Dr. Bennett shows up and tells Will the real story of how he was born, that his father had been in Wichita making sales the day he was born, which I can personally relate to since my father was away at war the day I was born. Edward wakes up and asks Will to tell him the story of how he goes. Will asks Edward if he's talking about what he saw in the witch's eye and that he doesn't know that story, and asks Edward how it starts. And the moment that Edward says, "like this," we're shown the final tall tale of Edward Bloom's life. And most of this is straight from the novel. Will helps his father escape from the hospital and drives him to the river. And all the people throughout Edward's life are waiting for him, waiting to say goodbye. And as Will brings his father Edward into the river, Sandra is waiting for him. And just as Will drops his father into the river, Edward becomes teeming with life and becomes what he always was, a very big fish. At the end of the film, Edward's funeral is held at the Spectre Church, where Will is very surprised to see many of the people from his father's stories and realizes that there was much more truth to these tall tales than he had realized. So at this point, I'd like to discuss a phenomenon that stood out to me upon rewatching this film recently. My girlfriend had never seen this film, so I decided to watch it with her, and the moment I saw Carl, I looked at her and I said, "That actor is probably dead." Now, I didn't actually know this for a fact, but was just making an educated guess based on prior knowledge. Being that the film Big Fish was released back in 2003, nearly 20 years ago, and seeing as the actor playing Carl was over 20 years old in the film, I thought it was reasonable to assume that he was deceased, because I recognized the condition that he had, the very condition that landed him this role in the film. The actor Matthew McGrory clearly had a condition called acromegaly, something I had known about prior to rewatching Big Fish as an adult, because I had watched a documentary about a teenager with the same illness. And it's actually pretty easy to identify. And I knew that most people with this condition don't typically seem to live past the halfway point of the average life expectancy of most people. Matthew sadly died at 32, only 2 years after Big Fish was released. Another famous case of someone who died of this illness was Andre the Giant, who died at 46 years old. Just like Edward Bloom in Big Fish, this illness causes one to grow so rapidly that their bones and muscles literally can't keep up with the growth, leading to many people with acromegaly dying at a very young age, which was obviously the inspiration for Edward's rapid growth in the film. And so I thought it very fitting that they would have an actor with the actual condition portray the giant Carl in the film. This was a very beautiful touch to the film, using this real-life illness as an allegory for the character, Edward being a big fish in a little pond and wanting to escape the confines of his small-town life. Upon doing further research into this illness, I learned that acromegaly is very similar to dwarfism or achondroplasia, that it's essentially the opposite illness. But both illnesses are caused by an imbalance of growth hormone in the pituitary gland around puberty. Now, I'm not a scientist or a doctor, so forgive me for my lack of knowledge on the subject, but the definition of the specific illnesses vary greatly and can change based on the time in a person's life that the onset of these symptoms manifest. However, to keep things simple, I'm just going to use the terms gigantism and dwarfism. And while researching these topics, I came across an incredibly interesting article that highlighted a specific case, and I am not exaggerating when I say that upon reading about this man, I was so shocked at what I read that I literally didn't believe it. I thought I was reading a fictional account of a man's life. It's so insanely fantastical that I couldn't believe it was real, but it absolutely was, so I thought it was worth mentioning in this video. Big Fish is a story about an ordinary man who lives an absolutely fantastical life, where many of the details of his past seem impossible or made up. So in the spirit of Big Fish, I'd like to introduce you to a man named Adam Rayner. Adam Rayner experienced both dwarfism and gigantism. He is the only person in recorded history to have been both a dwarf and a giant. From the time he was born until he was in his early 20s, Adam's height was somewhere around 3 foot 8 inches. Around the age of 23, Adam began to grow at a rate of approximately 3.2 inches a year. At the age of 33, Adam had grown to about 7 foot 2 inches. He died at 51 years old, reaching a height of about 7 foot 8 inches. He literally grew to death, growing from under 4 feet to almost 8 feet in the span of about 20 years, all happening after the average human being would have been done growing entirely. If this isn't a fairy tale in real life, I don't know what is. And in the film, Edward meets the two conjoined twin sisters, another real-life phenomenon used in the film to make Edward's life seem like a fantasy. So, returning to the end of Big Fish, Will finally understands that not only had many of his father's tall tales been grounded in reality, but that his father was simply creating a persona of the man he aspired to be, and that maybe he just wanted to create a reality for his son to look up to, one that he himself could aspire to be. Maybe his father wasn't being cruel in masking his life with all these stories, but rather showing his son what kind of life someone should aim for. I've always thought that the point of a goal isn't to be a realistic expectation, but rather something to shoot for, and so logically, you should make your goals as ambitious as possible, even if they seem unreasonable. Most people won't ever achieve their greatest ambitions. But wouldn't it make more sense that if we make our goals hard to achieve, that it would bring us that much closer to achieving them? That it would make us that much more successful? If you tell yourself, I want to run a marathon, and you only run half a marathon, didn't that goal at the very least help you achieve something more than you ever would have? My father always had this very interesting analogy about being focused. He would say, would you rather have your hand stepped on by a boot or a high heel? And obviously I would always say the boot. The high heel would go straight through my hand. And he would reply, yes, because the high heel has focus. It's focusing all that energy on one point. And if you want to be successful, you have to focus all your efforts on one goal. In Big Fish, Edward relates his life to his son through analogies like this. But he tells these stories literally, all because he wants his son to be better than himself, which again is very relatable to me. My father would always tell me that his main goal was to help his children be better than himself. Edward comes from humble beginnings and clearly wants his son to live a better life than he did. All of Edward's tall tales were fables, meant to teach his son a valuable lesson, very similar to Aesop's fables or Grimm's fairy tales, which were meant to teach children lessons. It was all done out of love. Yes, maybe Edward wanted to be remembered as a great man, but by the end of the film, Will understands that what he thought were simple lies were actually lessons for him, and that his father truly loved him. And it's at least clear to me that Edward was absent for a large portion of Will's childhood, because he was a traveling salesman and was trying to earn an honest living for his family and provide for them. Something I can personally relate to, as my father was absent for several years of my life defending our country overseas in the military. And it hurt, but as an adult, I fully understand that he was doing it for me, for my family. Not only did my father miss my birth, but also my graduation from high school. And I understand that this was all done out of love. I have this very vivid memory of when I was 6 years old, standing in the foyer of my home and looking up at the chandelier, and my father telling me that he could jump and touch the chandelier if he really wanted to. And I said, "Really? You could do that?" And he said, "Actually, I can jump and touch the moon if I really want to." And you know what? I believed every word. I literally thought my dad was a superhero. And to tell you the truth, my opinion has never changed. My dad is a superhero, and even though he told me tall tales as a child, I understand now that he wasn't lying to me. He just wanted to inspire me. He wanted me to touch the moon. And that's what a father does when he loves his son.
What's up, buddy?
Hey, how's it going?
Good, how you doing? What are you up to?
Oh, not bad. I'm just getting some work done and hanging out. Do you remember when we were standing in the foyer of the house and you said you could like jump and touch the chandelier? And then I was like, "Really? You can do that?" And you're like, "Actually, I can jump and touch the moon." Do you remember this at all?
I think I might have said that to you in different ways about 1,000,000 times.
I think that's absolutely correct. But there's that one instance that I remember when I was like 6 years old, and I legitimately believed it. Did you know that?
No.
100% thought you really could do that.
Right. And this gets to what we've been talking about with your thoughts on the movie Big Fish, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I hadn't thought about it until you mentioned it today. This idea that he kind of taught these outlandish, he gave these outlandish stories of this as if they were true or really happened or possible, and so it did cause me to think, why did I say things like that to you? And I think what I wanted to inspire in you was just this idea that you were limitless in your possibility. And I still, as you know, we've talked about this lots of times, certainly we do have some limits, but I tend to think that we're capable of so much more than we possibly will allow ourselves to accept as possibilities in our lives. In part because people have told you can't.
Yeah.
And I think I always wanted you to believe, because I believe it's true, that you ultimately can. And I think, in all honesty, not making up stories, if you told me that you wanted to be a brain surgeon, I believe you could do it. And if you told me you wanted to be an astronaut, I think you could do it. Or anything else.
Hit me with your best dad joke.
Best dad joke.
Yeah, like it could be a long one. It could be one of these long-winded ones about like I remember the kid on the scooter gets caught on the car. You know, hit me with one of those.
The classic.
Yeah.
You got me stuck when you said the best one, because they're all pretty much equally terrible. I went to survival, evasion, resistance, escape school in the military, and a portion of that school was learning how to survive in the desert. And so they throw you out in the middle of the desert with basically nothing. You don't have food and water, and you don't have shelter or anything. So you have to figure out how to make it work out there in the middle of nowhere. And I honestly didn't think I was going to make it. And so I'm out there in the middle of nowhere, and I see this other guy, he's walking across the desert, and he had what looked to be some kind of canteen in his hand. I said, "What do you got there?" And he said, "Well, I have this device that I created to collect and maintain water, and I have managed to do that. And so now when I get thirsty, well, this device that I created is full of water now, and so I won't die of thirst out here." And I thought, man, that's really a great idea. I need to think about how I can do that. The guy went his way. He has to survive too. We're all going different paths. And then a little later, I saw this guy come by, and he's got some kind of sack in his hand. And I said, what do you got there? And he said, "Well, this inside here, I have this bag that I formed, and I have found what is some kind of dew or something out here in the desert, and I collect it, and it's kind of like bread, and so this stuff with this sack that I have, and I've got another device I made to help collect it. I made these with my hands, so I can put all this together, and then I can eat this, and I won't starve to death while I'm out there. I thought, man, that's really great. So I'm walking a while, and then I see this other guy, and he's dragging across the desert a car door. And I'm watching this guy from a distance, and he's coming, and he is dragging with all his strength this car door across the desert. It's like I think this has got to be hard. It's about 127 degrees out. And so finally this guy, I just sit down and I watch, if he's dragging this thing through the sand, he gets up to me and he's breathing heavy. And I said, what do you have there? What are you doing? And he goes, oh, it's a car door out here. And I go, okay, you got a car door. What are you doing with the car door, and why are you dragging across the desert? He said, it's pretty hot out here, right? I said, yeah, it's really hot out here. He goes, yeah, well, with this, it gets hot, I just roll down the window. So that's dead. Okay.
That was great. That's exactly what I was looking for. Thank you.
Yeah, well, there you go. But I didn't want to disappoint.
No, that was exactly what I was looking for. Before I end this video, I just want to quickly shout out you guys. Don't think for a second that I don't see the few of you who always come back and always comment on every video. You're very noticed and very appreciated, so thank you. Just like my life, this channel is a bit chaotic and unpredictable. I sometimes take close to half a year off from uploading, and I know that makes it hard to want to stick with me, and it makes things hard for me with the old algorithm. This channel is very feast or famine. I'm either absolutely killing it or I'm getting like a couple hundred views on a video. I just want you to know that no matter what happens with this channel, I'm always giving it 100 and making quality content my #1 priority. And if you don't hear from me for a while, I assure you that I'll come back. It's hard for me at this point to see a time when I completely lose interest in this. And I literally have hundreds of different videos I've been wanting to make for a long time. So thanks again, truly. Oh my God. Yeah! Yes! There's the proof, ladies and gentlemen, of my victory.